Hey, I got to totally set us up here. We're live inside of a beautiful forest here in South Carolina. So we've either got some very active forest rangers in the background or very noisy beavers. So if you hear something, just ignore it. It's just nature taking care of itself.
Noisy beaver, I love it.
Mo Rocca, my God, you have got something here that is an inspiration for all people to want to grow forward. I love the idea and everything that you're putting into Roctogenarians.
Thank you very much. It was really a joy to write. I kind of did it for selfish reasons because I was looking for inspiration. Because this idea that the last third of your life should be a time to wind things down is nonsense. I don't know where it came from, but it's a very powerful and bad influence, I think. And so my co-author and I, John Greenberg, and I came up with these stories, compiled these stories of people that really killed it in old age.
I was going to ask you if you pulled from each one of these stories because there is something that happens as we get older. It's like, okay, there's still a lot more left in me. I want to know what I can learn from the older people as well as the younger people. It's almost like we've got the best of both worlds.
Well, I think that there are a few commonalities among these people. These are people that don't look backward. Okay, they're not doing a highlights reel of their own lives, not living through that day after day. They act, they're in it. So Harlan Sanders,
yes,
Colonel Sanders
yes.
is a great example. I mean, he was living his life. He had a little Shell gas station / chicken and biscuits joint in the small town of Corbin, Kentucky. A highway comes through Kentucky, bypasses the town of Corbin, and the bottom falls out of his business. So at the age of 66, after having to sell his little chicken joint at a loss, he gets in a car, living off of Social Security, with 2 pressure cookers and his recipe of 11 herbs and spices, and he drives town to town, restaurant to restaurant, cooking for people, hooking them on the recipe, and within 8 years, he is the face of a Kentucky Fried empire of 800 outlets worldwide. So he did that out of need, but he did it because he could have subsisted off of that Social Security, but that wasn't good enough for him. There are actors like the actress Estelle Getty, because we had to include at least one Golden Girl, who spent her life doing bit parts on stage, acting wherever she could. She had married at 23. She had 2 sons. She raised her family. When her sons went off to college, she said, you know what? I got to pursue this thing full time. And she went to a playwright, Harvey Fierstein, asked him to write a part for her in a play. And before she knew it, at age 62, she made her television debut in The Golden Girls and became one of the most hilarious characters, I'd say, of the last 40 years. And they're writers. I mean, the writers, I love the story of Frank McCourt because I love that book, Angela's Ashes, which was a literary sensation. He had these great stories of growing up in Ireland. He was a high school English teacher. His students said, you got to write them down. You got to write a book. But he was racked with doubt. He said, I don't have a story that's worth telling. He was ashamed that he grew up in poverty. And finally, he decided that he would, in his words, die howling if he didn't get the story out. And so he wrote it. It was a literary sensation, released when he was 66,
Wow.
His literary debut. And he later said, it took 2 years and all of my life to write this. And I love that story because there's so many people who feel like their stories aren't worth telling, and that's very, very sad to me.
Oh, Mo Rocca, I'll tell you, here's the thing. I've always believed by the mantra, share your story or someone will write it for you. And I just believe that there is such a giant story in as many people as we can meet. We've just got to take the time to listen to them. And I think that's what you're providing here. You're giving us that chance to listen to these stories.
Well, I appreciate that. One person who couldn't tell their own story was Mr. Pickles, the Houston Zoo tortoise, who at the age of 90 became a first-time father. I mean, look, you're impressed by Al Pacino having a kid at 83. Mr. Pickles had him beat by 7 years. So they're personal late-in-life milestones. Like the actress Carol Channing,
yes,
she was stuck in a loveless marriage for 40 years. She said her husband only had sex with her twice. Apparently, the matinee and evening performances were both panned by the critics. And then finally, after her husband died, she hooked up with her junior high school sweetheart at 82. He was 83. And the last couple of years of their lives were blissful because she finally found personal happiness at the very end. It's never too late.
One of the things that you point out clearly in this book is you say that 80 is the new 60. Well, even at 62, I still feel like I'm 16. I mean, just feel vibrant and keep marching forward.
Yeah, absolutely. They weren't looking back. They were still very much in it. I mean, you see that a lot with architects. Interestingly, that peak late in life. Frank Lloyd Wright was already very celebrated, but he'd been counted out. People thought he was past his prime. He was 84 when he submitted the design for the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And even then, artists said, no, this is not good. It's bad for the art. Well, 1.3 million visitors a year would disagree with that because they come in that building is an icon. I mean, it's one of the great buildings. I mean, if you've seen Hitchcock's North by Northwest, you know it. There are also very interesting stories of widows because I think in this, some people might disagree with me, but listen, I've met a lot of older women who love their husbands, who will be very sad when their husbands depart this life, but will also feel a little bit liberated. And so you've got widows who did kind of amazing things. The Madame Clicquot was a French woman who, after being widowed, built a champagne empire, Veuve Clicquot. And so it's a range of stories, but they all have in common that they weren't going to let Act 3 of life be a flop.
In your own way and in your heart, did you ever want to just put at the top of the book, right there on the front cover, they did it without the power of social media. They did it the old-fashioned way.
Well, that is a great subtitle. I mean, I had thought of titling the book "Not Dead Yet" with an exclamation point, but I think that's a great subtitle. They did it without social media. Well, I think there's actually an interesting point because social media is great in a lot of ways, but what these people did is they didn't crowdsource. They didn't go on whatever the equivalent of the internet would have been and say, "What do you think?" They weren't. They said, "Here's what I'm going to do," and they did it.
Yep.
And I think it's so important to just go for it. And I think I think, again, you feel liberated at that age because you know that ultimately it doesn't matter if it fails. So what? I also think there's a kind of generosity that sets in at that age. There's a great story, the great story of Mary Church Terrell, who was a woman who spent her life battling for civil rights, an activist against the brutal practice of lynching. And at 86, when she had more than earned her rest, she decided to lead sit-ins at segregated Washington, D.C. lunch counters. And what I find so powerful about that story, in part, is that she was fighting for a world that she really wasn't going to get to enjoy. I mean, at best, she was going to live, say, into her 90s, and she did indeed die at 90, right after the Supreme Court ruled in her favor and desegregated public accommodations like lunch counters. But there's something very powerful about somebody putting their butt on the line like that late in life.
Yeah. Please come back to this show anytime in the future, Mo. The door is always going to be open for you.
Arrow, thank you very much. Good being with you.
You be brilliant today, okay?
All right, thank you.